Okay, hey guys. So this is the second part of the introduction to Rhinoceros software. Just left off with starting to work a little bit with curves, the polylines. I didn't really show these. This is for the free-form curve, so you can start to see here that I'm creating a series of points, but gesturally it's averaging those overall to create these different curves there. You notice that there are these were points that were created when I created both of these curves. Those are called control points. There are control points for lines and they're control points for surfaces. So if I select this and I hit my F10 key, and my laptop, I actually have to hold down the function key and hit F10, that'll basically turn on the control points. Also, you should be able to do that with one of these commands here. Let's see here, edit points on, edit points off. So I can turn edit points on, and these are points on as well. Points on, points off, edit points on, edit points off. All right, so now I can, just like I can select anything, I can select certain control points, whether it's one, and I can start to move this curve around. I can select two, and I can start to move this around. So I can continue to manipulate the curve that way in order to render a particular configuration, let's say. To turn those off, I just hit my escape key a few times. And so, again, this is a little bit more exact, but on the curve, but these edit points, it basically does the same thing. And again, I could select a couple of these and move this around. You can see the curve is just kind of averaging the overall configuration, how this will distort based off of the position of the others. And so there's some relationship between these points here as they define that curve. That's a little bit different than this with the straight edges that I used this polyline tool for, or with. Again, F10, so now if I select one of these, it's going to be pretty absolute. These are straight segments, and so the surrounding points are going to maintain their location, and it's just this one that'll change those particular vectors, and so the object snaps will respond accordingly. And again, I can select a couple of these, move those around in concert to one another. But because it's a different kind of curve, there's a different kind of characteristic to this line. You can see it's kind of averaging the position of all of those curves, or all the points rather. You can see they're off the actual curve. It's because it's a sort of an average of all of those. It's trying to understand the dynamic of each of the position of each of them relative to one another, as opposed to this straight segment polyline that isn't doing that. It's more absolute. And that relationship is important not only for lines but also surfaces. So if I go into perspective view, I can also turn on control points here again, either F10 or you can use this tool here. It has certain control points here, and I can window select some of these or just point select one of these, and I can start distorting that image one way or the other. Now I'm holding down my left button here on the mouse, but I can still use my right to orbit and navigate around a little bit. So that's nice to know. And I can also jump to other views. So if I go off here to right, see it's still selected. Now I don't have anything selected right now, or holding anything down because I went off the window. I changed the view, so now it still just has it selected. And it's, you can see I can go perfectly up. I can hold my shift key and go perfectly up. This is the wireframe view. It's a little bit harder to see. I can go back to my ghosted. So maybe I just wanted this to be perfectly up. Or I could type in a distance as well and an angle, just like I'm drawing a line. So maybe that's it. I'll escape to get rid of that, and you can see how that starts to change that surface. Control Z to go back, escape to remove those lines. So that's part of editing. I jumped ahead a little bit, but that's part of editing. So to create surfaces, there are a variety of ways to do that. Here I tend to use this tool. Again, you could use the pull down here, but the visual cues that this provides I think are pretty handy. So surface creation, that's one that I don't have up here right now, but that's one you may want to have. So you can dock it as a tab so you can access these pretty quickly. I guess sometimes it starts to get too filled up at the top, and so that's one I'm comfortable with going here to this side one. But there are different ways to create surfaces. So one way is just a 2-point surface, and if I'm in this perspective view, it's going to assume that it's flat down on that surface, on the construction plane rather. So it's going to create that. Again, it's relative to the layer that I'm on. So if I delete this and I switch to, I don't know, let's say Loft, and I do the same thing, obviously it's going to be on that layer. Right? Delete. Let's see, the other ways to create a surface is by defining the corner points. Let me see, if you could see here how this is orbiting. You see it's orbiting about a point that's sort of off there, and I could fix that. If I go into my standard view, I could select a particular object that I want to orbit around. So let's say it's this object that I want to orbit around, and I can go up here to my different zoom options. I can dynamically zoom here using this tool, so it's going to just left click scroll up and down. It's a little bit more accurate than using your scroll wheel, so that's a little bit smoother. That's also, I believe, a shortcut that you can get to if I hold my control key down and right click, I can get to that in the orthographic view. So I'm holding control and then right clicking, and then that'll give me this kind of smoother zoom. Again, right click without that in this perspective view is going to be orbit. And right now it's because I zoomed into it, it's now starting, the view is orbiting around that particular object. But say I didn't do that yet, and maybe I want to orbit around one of these objects. You can see it's not doing that, it's still relative to what's going on here. I can select that object, and then that's sort of the magnifying glass with this little push pin in it, zoom selected. It's going to zoom me up to that object, and now it's going to orbit about that object. So that's a really important tool to know as you're navigating around, because if you're trying to do something here and trying to orbit or navigate around, you can see it's sliding around in some really weird ways, as opposed to using this zoom selected, and now it's really orbiting about the object there. So it's much easier to know that. That's an important tool to have available to you. Let's see, surface creation. I tend to use this flat plane a lot. Again, there are different options. A rectangular plane with 3 points. Maybe I'll just go into top view. I haven't really used this one, to be honest, but I'll hold my shift key down, and it looks like it's just the height, and then you can give it a width, right? Okay, so that's pretty easy. And so there are different options to do that, obviously vertically, and so forth. Let's see. And these are basically from other objects. So I could, here's this one we just created, this curve. I could basically extrude that straight. This is basically extrude a curve. So I tend to go up here to the pull down menu. I'm kind of all over the place with this one, but I would go to surface, and then just because it's the words maybe that I'm attached to, I can see that extrude curve, and I can go straight or along a curve, or have these different options. So if I go straight, select this object, right click, I can just extrude that straight up or down, right? I can also type in a distance. So if I wanted that to be 48 inches, there, now it's 48 inches tall. So that's just a direct extrusion. And if I had another line, let's say I had, I'll just create, I'm going to start with the line here, and right now it's assuming that I want it to be flat. I'll pick it up. Let's see, there. There we go. Oops, you threw that all the way back into crazy space. One tool, if that happens, we'll find that view. Let's see. Okay, what's that to the right? Okay. If I wanted to flatten that to make sure that that was up, it's flat on the surface anyway, so that's not really going to do me any good. I'm just actually going to delete that, and I'm going to start again here. And I'm just going to go into my front view, and I'm going to not select, I can just type in 0, 0, 0, make sure I'm on the right plane. I can select an angle up or whatever, any orientation I want. I'm just going to do that. Now I can take this and I can move it, and I'll go here to the move command, endpoint to endpoint. And now I will be able to, again, I'm on the loft layer, but I can extrude this along that curve, along that line. So instead of straight up, it's going to go along that curve. So, see, I don't like waiting for these little bubbles to pop up. Maybe that's it. Extrude along curve. Okay, select the curves to extrude. I want to extrude that curve. Right click to enter that. Select path curve near the start. Here. So now you can see it's kind of at an angle along that start there. So it'll extrude it up there. This, because it has different segments, again, it would be more of a poly surface instead of a single simple surface. That's important to know because I can't turn on the control points for a poly surface, right? Only for simple surface. So I would have to explode this in order to get to the points or what have you. Some other things about this toolbar that are important. Again, here are the surfaces. These are just creating 2 line components here. Different modifiers to fillet the surface, to fillet a curve. I can create a simple box here, so I can select that. I could, again, type this in if I wanted to, but I can create simple masses fairly quickly. Type in would be, box. So I selected a point, and I could simply select at, say, 24, 24 inches. And now it wants a height, and I can select 36 inches. I'm just typing this in. And that's so I can be really precise with the kind of block that I create, or box that I create. There are others in here, cylinders, spheres, all these other things. I don't tend to use these a whole lot. Even the box I don't really use very much. There are other tools you can project certain objects here. So say I wanted to project something on that surface. I can go to top view, and maybe I want to draw, let's just draw a circle. There we go, just center, and then again I could type that in, but I just selected a circle here for the radius, or distance for the radius. So now I could project that curve on this surface. So let's go back to that command. Okay, select curves and points to project. I want to select that curve, right click to enter it. The surfaces to project onto that surface, right click. And now if I go into my perspective view, and I can go back to my, see it's orbiting about something else, I can automatically select it, so here I am. And you can see it just projected that straight up onto that surface. And now I have that as an object. Perhaps I want to use that for something. It's kind of handy for a lot of different things, but you can see how that works there. Let's see, so that's project. These are mesh tools. I don't really get into using mesh tools, and I don't think we'll cover that really this semester. This is the join tool. You can join lines so that they are together. Let me just zoom in on this. Right now these are already together, and I could explode that. There's the tool right next to join, so the opposite of that. So now I just exploded it, and these are individual lines now. So if I wanted to join all these together, I have to select them. So that was one window. If I hold my shift key down, I can add to the selection. So I can keep adding to it. I can even add this one if I wanted to. If I wanted to deselect anything from the selection as I'm doing this, I don't even have a command selected yet, so I'm just selecting the objects. I hold my control key down so I can remove an object from the selection if I hold my control key down. So if I want to add, hold shift. If I want to remove, hold down control. So here I can either use this command, this little puzzle piece for join, or so you can just type in join and automatically do that. So that's what that tool is about. Of course, explode is to do the opposite of that. It's going to explode those all into little pieces. I'll use this box. You can also explode surfaces. I did this in the other video, but right now this is a solid, basically poly surface. I can explode it. And now it's the individual panels that you'll see there. You can delete them or do whatever you want to do with them. ControlZ. And ControlZ, I still want that to be a box. Let's see, explode. There's trim here. So let's take a quick out. I was going to show it on this other example, just so you can see how dynamic this is. This is another file that I'll have available. It just has this object on it. But it's just nice because it's dynamic enough to see what Rhino can really do. So I'm going to go into a, let's say, a right view, apparently, and I'm going to draw just a shape that I want to either trim or split from this overall poly surface. So, well, let's just do a freeform thing. So it's going to be kind of going and object snapping. I want to be freer than that, so I'm going to disable my object snap. And I'm going to hold my shift key down. I tend to keep the ortho on and hold my shift key down if I want to free form. Depends on what I'm doing, but that's what I tend to do. It's up to you. So I don't even care where this overall curve is. It's basically on the construction plane. So it's, if I zoom out in the perspective, it's kind of off, way off there, right? Because when I draw, it's going to assume, just like in the top view, it's going to assume that I want that to be on the whatever the zero plane may be, depending on the orientation. It was the right view, and so it threw it back on the construction plane. This has a little construction plane there, but that's where that would be located. So you can see that relative, it'd be here. It's right on that axis. But that doesn't matter. These don't have to be touching for me to use the split or the trim command. So I can go back into right view, and I can say, okay, I want to trim everything that is inside of this line from that object. So I'll select trim, and the cutting object I want to be this curve. Right click, select object to trim. Now I want to select the areas I want to go away. So just slice right through it. So if I go to the perspective view, you can see kind of some fairly unexpected results there. But it just really simply did that, right? Trim that area right out, and just because of the orientation of the view, it knew that that's how I wanted to trim it. So it just did that. Didn't have to be touching or right on. I know AutoCAD to kind of, if you want to trim that way, those objects have to be sort of on, they have to be coplanar, essentially. These don't have to do that. You just have to be sort of in the right orientation in a view, and you can execute the command. And that's true for perspective. It's true for any of the other sort of views there. Okay, so if I want to ControlZ, bring that back, I can say I didn't necessarily want to trim that, but I just want to split this part out. That's where the split command would come into. So let's select the object to split. I want to split this overall poly surface. Right click to register that. Select the cutting objects. It's my curve that I created. Right click, and now what it did, it created two overall poly surfaces. One is this overall object that's outside, and that is now split from what's inside of that. So I can go to top view, and now I can move. This is the move command, and we talked about the control points. We're actually here to split, but yeah, we can sort of move those. And so that could be useful for certain things, right? Just displace that. there. Maybe I wanted to keep both of those. Control Z back. This is for grouping, so actually, let me go redo and redo. Control Y. So it looks like, these now are split into a couple different, see this little fragment that's floating there. Maybe for some reason I wanted these to be all one group, so similar to Illustrator or AutoCAD. I know I showed you guys. This is the group command. So either, again, this is the icon. You can just type in group as well. So now that's one object that I can move around onto itself. Of course, the opposite of that is ungroup. So you can work with it that way. So another nice part of it, group, other parts of the command is that you can, ungroup is here, you can add to the group or you can subtract from the group. So say for example, I wanted all of these to be grouped together. Right now this is one object, this is another object. If I wanted to group these together, I could do that. Okay, there's a group. If I want to maybe take this piece out of that overall group, I could subtract from the group. Oops, you select the object that you want. Enter, and now that's a group, but this is on its own. If I want to add that back into the group, and it depends on how you want to do it. I think if this is already a group and then I regrouped it with this, there's multiple layers of groups, so sometimes that could be a little confusing. The way around that is just to add to the group. So select objects to add. I want to add this object, right click, select the group, that's the group, and that's done. So now it's all one group. So again, that's handy for as your models get a little bit more complex. Group ungroup, control points, we talked about that. There's text that you can create in Rhino for annotation or what have you. Let's just go to the top. So the text tool, Rhino, I guess, is the default, and so you can add text if you wanted to here, different attributes to it, and that ends up being a series of surfaces. So in terms of like laser cutting and anything, it'll behave the same as any kind of surface. This is for moving. So just a little box moving to another box, so I can take this and then just move, enter, origin point, and then displacement. Again, I can type in a particular distance, 24, let's say, and it's going to move that exact amount, so you can be precise about it. This is copy. And so I can right-click, make several copies of all of this fairly quickly. The other nice thing about the NURBS-based is that you can get fairly complex things going fairly quickly, but also it because of the way it processes that the modeling engine, it's still fairly responsive. So it takes a lot to get it bogged down. You can bog it down, but it takes a bit. Let's see, rotate. Rotate is pretty important. So again, there's a left click and a right click option for this. So if I left click, I'm going to go into an ortho view because it's assuming orthographic orientation with this 2D rotate. So there's 2D and 3D. So I'll take this. Let's take this guy and right click. It's going to ask me for a point of origin. So that could be a particular point if you wanted to. And again, right now it's because I have ortho selected, it's 90 degrees, but if I want it to be something else, I can hold my shift key down or just untoggle ortho and that would get rid of that, but I could sort of rotate it that way. But it's about now the Z-axis in this case, and depending on the view, it's going to be about, if I select this, and I right-click to re-execute the last command, and now this is going to be about X or Y, whatever this view might be. It's the right, so I guess it would be X. Okay, so that can be limiting, depending on how you want it to rotate. It's fairly absolute about the orthographic orientation of things. Let's say I wanted to rotate something about this axis, whatever this might be, this line right here. And that's what I needed to rotate. And so you can do that. It's the right click option here for rotate, 3D rotate. And so it's going to say, okay, select objects to rotate, select it, right click to enter, start of the rotation axis. So it's not assuming any axis here about X, Y, or Z. I'm creating that. So endpoint here, endpoint there. Now it wants so you can see it's now oriented to that line. First angle, angular first reference point, so I could select this right here. And I hold my shift key down. Now I'm rotating about that axis. And so that's pretty important again when your geometries start to become more complex, or even if you think about kind of the cut and fold technique that we had been working with the previous exercises. You guys are doing that manually, but in this case that can be done virtually, right? You can fairly easily start to fold things, right? So say for example I wanted to create a little split on this, endpoint here to corner, endpoint there to corner. Now I have this line, and I can split this surface if I explode it. Explode it again. Oh, it's grouped. So I have to ungroup it. Huh. In any case, I guess it's one surface. Let's check that. Oh, it's still a poly surface. So that was because of the group. Now I can explode it. There we go. So it was because it was grouped a couple times, like I talked about before, and then I had to explode it. Anyway, say I wanted to, fold this part of the surface up or down or what have you about this axis, right? Right now that's a flat surface, so one thing I would have to do is to split it. So I would say I would go into top view in this case, and go into split. Object to split is this, right click, cutting object. That's why the command prompt is nice. It's asking you and telling you there are other options here too. We'll get into some of those later, but I want to split it about that. So now I have these two parts of that surface. So now I can go back to perspective and say I wanted to take this part and rotate it up or down about that axis, kind of just fold it like you would a piece of paper. Right click, start of the rotation axis, the end of it, the reference angle. Now this is perpendicular to it, so I can just pick this edge right here and holding the shift key down. In my case, again, I could just, it's going 90 degrees, I could just toggle that off. So now I can just fold this up or down or what have you exactly about that axis. So cutting and folding starts to be pretty clearly achievable here. Let's see. Kind of got into a lot of what I wanted to. A few other nice tools. I'm gonna just get a little crazy here. Delete all that. Oops. ControlZ. I'll keep one of them. Project a construction plane, unroll, curve for objects. Okay, I'm gonna come back to this. So I'll do the projection. Let's see. I'm gonna go back to this other file and get back into creating some other surfaces. I kind of sidetracked into editing, but I'll show you a little bit about to create some surfaces here. So these are set up curves, as you can see, and there's a simple command that is called Loft to create a surface. So I can say whatever these profiles are, it's going to consider them as profiles, I can start to loft those. So surface, loft, and I have to be careful. I want to loft all of these three together. I have to be careful on how I select these. I kind of want to select the curve in the same area that I want to be attached one to the next. If I select across, so say this left on this profile, the right on this profile, and then back to the left, it's going to factor that into the selection. So I'll do it correctly first. 1, 2, and I can select as many of these profiles as I want. And you can have some options here, but I tend to keep the do not simplify there and normal. So then you can see, just orient my view, pretty accurately we created some pretty dynamic things here, right? Pretty interesting form. ControlZ. Now if I do that incorrectly, so surface loft, and I selected opposite side, so here's the right and then the left, it's going to factor then kind of twist the overall form. So unless you're looking for that, be aware of how you're selecting various profiles to Loft, because it's going to factor that into those, right? So ControlZ, I want to make sure, again, I can right click to get back into Loft, or select it from the pull down or what have you. In this case I'll just do the right side, so I want to make sure I want to be in the right side of each of the profiles, since that's there. And we see it's nice and smooth. And that could happen with other forms. This is just slightly different, a little bit more simplistic. And I'll hit OK. So that's the Loft tool, and again I can do that with a variety of objects here. I can loft these profiles to achieve some particular overall form, and so it doesn't really matter the shape of the form, as long as it can work with those. You can sort of do that. Get ControlZ. So let's see, surface. I can sweep one rail. Let's see, sweep one rail. Let's do this. Zoom into here. So this is meant to be the profile, and then this is the rail that I want to sweep it about. So I want to first select the rail. That's this. So it's automatically, I don't have to right click, it's automatically going to ask for cross-section curves. It could be several. In this case it's just one. Same would apply if there were several that you'd want to select in a similar area that would connect one surface to the next to keep it continuous. So I'll select this and then right click. It's going to ask me for the direction of the seam. I'll accept that. You can flip it if you wanted to, the direction of that seam, but I don't see a need for that. Let me just go back into it, right click, and there we go. We made that form pretty quickly. So that's sweep one rail. You can also sweep two rails. Let's see, sweep two rails. So we'll use this. This is very similar to what we had going on over here, but instead of creating it by lofting, I'm going to use these two rails. So that's the path I wanted to follow. And I can use these two profiles or other profiles, but you'll see what I mean. First rail here, second rail there. Now it's automatically going to ask for the cross-section curves. So basically then it's going to transform this profile into this one about these layers or along those layers. And so it's just on its own being able to calculate that transition. Right. ControlZ. I could do that just with one of these profiles, so I can go back into that command, sweep two rails, one rail, two rails. Let's use this triangle as the cross-section curve and forget about that one. So it's going to take into consideration the profile, the curve, and adjust the scale and proportion accordingly. But you can be very definitive if you wanted to let Rhino this is sort of the blob to box kind of model that UN Studio refers to, and I may talk about later on. But this profile to that profile, and allowing the computer to make the transition between the two. That's a hard thing for us to imagine just on our own or manually, so that's why using a tool like this makes some sense. So again, one rail, two rails, the cross section, I want to still select in the same area, so the right of that one to the right of this one, and there we go. Do not simplify, I would try to have it be absolute to the surface. Let's see, revolve. And this is, the same case. Many programs have these kind of operations. Select curves to revolve. I want to revolve this profile. This is going to make a base. Enter the start of the axis, so I have to kind of like the 3D rotate. Wants to start and the end of the axis, so this can be anywhere in space. There. Let's do that one more time. Select the curves to revolve. Enter. Start of the axis. End of the axis. Curve selected to revolve include self-intersecting curves. This may produce undesirable results. You want to revolve these curves? Yes. 300 and the start angle 0, 360 degrees, or I can have a partial, and that created that form. I can also use an axis and a rail to create some things that are a little bit more, let's say, organic. Okay, surface rail revolve, it's called. So it's going to ask for the profile curve. Again, there could be many of these. In this case, there's just one. It asks for the rail. The rail is what's around here, so I'll select that. And the start rail revolve axis. So the start of that revolve axis, the end of it, and it created that form. So that could be sort of anything, right? So if I took this, turned on the control points, and maybe I wanted this to be way far out, and this one to be out over here. Kind of behaved awkwardly, but anyway, that's what I wanted to do. Rail revolve, the profile, the rail, start and the end of the axis. It's going to do that exactly how that rail was. So it's revolving around this axis, but following that rail, and that changes the scale of things. Surface is also take corner points. So let's say I wanted a surface. Let's find some corner points to be at these 4 corners. I can just select those corners in sequence. You don't want to cross these selections, so imagine like moving around the surface, and it'll just put that in space. I can do the same thing if I just execute that command. Oops. Corner points. And if I just had 3 selections, it'll just make a triangle. There's also curve network here. Select curves as part of the network, so I can just select all of these curves. And it's going to ask me for different tolerances, different edges. It's going to create that there. So it's a little bit more gestural. It's not quite as accurate as some of the other techniques there. As you can see, that's something you might use for like topography or something, but it's also one of the options. Surface. Surface. Extrude curve. Planar curve would be just planes and space. These are all sort of, here, I'll use this. It's a poly curve. Let's try it again. Might have to be closed for that. Let's try, let's see, planar curves. See, curves must be closed, planar loop, so it's because this is open. It doesn't like that. So I can close that. I can select all of these and then go to surface, planar curves, and I'll create the surface accordingly. Edge curves. Let's see. Yeah, edge curves. So it's basically asking for something that could define the edge. Let's use this here. Edges of the curve. So I'll disregard this middle member and just the curves that would be define the edges of that overall surface. And it'll create that. You can see it did something different than trying to follow that middle one because it's not really factoring that. I didn't select it. It's not part of the edges, right? So that's a different way to create a surface there. Delete that. Edge curves, I could, to be more accurate, of course, I could loft this or even have it on rails. So surface, I could sweep 2 rails if I wanted to be really accurate here. Select the first rail, maybe that's rail, and then that's a rail. Now cross section, 1, 2, 3, and this will be much more accurate to those overall profiles there. Let's see that. I think that's good for surfaces. Solids, again, it's mainly either boxes in terms of creating them. It's cylinders and boxes, so that is fairly straightforward. So I go into here, cylinder, it's going to ask me for a center point, obviously the base, radius, and then a height, right? Fairly straightforward. And you can create others here if you wanted to, say I wanted to have a pipe along this overall surface, then you could select pipe. It's going to ask for a radius, 1 inch is selected right now. If I wanted to change this diameter, I could just go up here and make different selections, like change the diameter if I wanted to. I'm just going to accept what's there. I'll hit enter, and then it created a pipe along there. And what makes it a solid is that it's a closed pipe in that condition. One nice thing too, as you're creating different kinds of solids, say for example, I know that these edges of this surface here are basically flat. So say what I wanted to do was make this into a solid. One thing that I could do to do that would be to enclose this surface there. So I might draw a line on the corners to close this off. And then I can go into surface, and then I can go use the edge curves as an example, and it's going to select the edge of that surface if there's no curve there. And so that closed it all up. And so then I can select these all and join them. So now it's one object. So all these surfaces are connected, but I have these open ends. So I could use the free-form surface to do that, but sometimes that gets to be a little bit difficult depending on the complexity of that. One nice tool that they have is under solid is cap planar holes, and it'll just automatically cap those off. So that's a nice command there. So the other thing, and we can get into playing around with these are fairly intuitive to create, but some of the things that you will get into, especially as you're working with the first project and topography, are the Boolean operations. And so the Boolean operations, here I have 2 objects here, 2 boxes, and so they're overlapping with one another. And I could do different things in terms of maybe I want this to subtract from that, or maybe I'm just looking for the intersection of those 2 or different options. And so under solid Boolean 2 objects, you can have a Boolean split, which would create 3 objects. So So let's just go ahead and select that. Select the surfaces or polysurfaces to split, enter. So now I have enter this. So it's split this object up from this object, creating this third object. And there are other Boolean operations as well. There's union, intersection, difference. But if you just select Boolean two objects here, select the two objects to Boolean, and I'm just going to left click through those other options here. So it's automatically assuming that here it's a union, here it's the intersection of those two, subtract from one, subtract from the other, and then we're back here. So you can see how that ends up being there. That basically was the subtract, to use that center sort of overlap to subtract from either one of these. So that's good, especially as you're thinking about topography or just working with masses. That's fairly handy. I'm going to end things, I think, here. That's enough for this overall tutorial. Again, I think with those basic tools, it's important for everyone to just start to get acquainted with the interface, start to play around with generating curves, and you can use this file to create these different objects as I did here, and just you guys can follow along with that. You can follow along with this other one here where I was just splitting basically some of the transform tools and moving. So take some time, get familiar with it. There are a lot more tools that are here in Rhino to be aware of and to use, but for now I think that's enough. One thing I think that's relative to what we'll kind of be getting into that you're able to do in Rhino, which kind of gets into fabrication and why we might use digital tools in the first place. It's a command called unroll developable surface, and so say I wanted to make this box using the laser cutter, I would need the template for all these sides and then have to figure out how to glue it together in one way or another. So just like you might find a box that you have collapsed, right? It has flaps and certain areas are folded. You can basically do that with Rhino. So if I select this and I go into surface and unroll developable surface, select the objects so I already did that. I have the object exploding. I'm going to say no to exploding, and that's just that selection. I can actually have labels on it so I can match it up with this original object, and key properties I'll say yes to keep it on the same layers and so forth. I'll hit enter, and now all of these seams here show up, and they correspond to these. It just generated this form. There happens to be this other object on it. It didn't create that, just this. So basically this is the overall layout to create that volume. And these seams, 17, 12, all those numbers correspond to these here. So you can see 16, 16, 17 would match up to the others accordingly. Here's 17 here. And so basically what we'd be able to do is, so move that out of the way, take this overall outline. I could select this and I could get the line work out of it, so I could curve from objects as an example, and get the you can do this in a variety of ways. One way is just to get the wireframe, extract the wireframe. I have to be careful to delete some of these lines that I don't really aren't really about anything other than how it's generated the surface, but now I just have those lines. I can take those and move them over here. Again, you can clean up some of these others that don't really matter, that are in the surface. You just want the edges and the seams or the folds. So you can select those and just hit delete. Of course, you have to ungroup it or delete it first, or explode it rather. So I'm getting rid of these. So basically these are the sides of the box. So once I had this sorted through, get rid of all these extra lines, I could then delete these, delete those, delete, Now these are all just the basic box surfaces. I could then select this. I could then go into File and Export Selected. I could then select AutoCAD DWG. Save it as whatever file type that you want in a corresponding folder. I'm just going to cancel it. Then I can open it up in AutoCAD. Use the laser template file. I would still have to scale it. This would have to be scaled down. This is all full scale, right? When you're drawing in virtual modeling, you want to make sure that you're drawing at 1-to-1 scale. And then you scale that overall object down to whatever scale the model is going to be. So 1/48 for a 1/4 inch and so forth. Scale it down, and then you could adjust the properties and so forth for the laser cutting template file, and then make the cuts, and then basically you'd be able to make the physical box. And you can do that with more complex shapes and forms as well. It has a little bit of difficulty with double curved sort of objects, so that's a bit of a challenge. And but there are other tools that we can use to automate that process as well. So this is kind of some of where we're going through, but again, feeding it into the overall workflow that we have for bringing in digital tools and using some of these others. So long enough, that's it for now, and we'll follow up with more Rhino tutorials as we get deeper into it. Thanks, guys.